I trusted my best friend with the business I built from scratch. He stole it from me by forging documents and throwing me out on the street. He thought I would disappear, but he didn't know that I had already planned his downfall. The day I met Marcus Reed at Boston University, I had no idea he would become both my greatest friend and my worst enemy. We clicked instantly, two business majors with big dreams and bigger ambitions. While other students partied, we spent nights drafting business plans over cheap beer and takeout. "We're going to make it big someday, Michael," Marcus would say, his eyes gleaming with that infectious confidence that made everyone gravitate toward him. "You with the brains, me with the charm, we're unstoppable." After graduation, while our classmates chased corporate jobs, we took the risk. Boston's nightlife scene was booming, but it lacked character. I had inherited $200,000 from my grandfather, not enough to retire on, but enough to start something. Marcus had connections from his summer jobs bartending at upscale establishments and the experience managing his father's restaurant before it closed. "Equal partners," I said the day we signed our agreement, pushing the document across the table. 50-50, all the way. "Brotherhood before business," Marcus replied, his signature flowing across the page. "Always." We opened our first bar, Last Call, in a renovated warehouse near the harbor. I handled finances and operations, Marcus managed staff and customer relations. Those first months were brutal. 18-hour days, sleeping on office couches, eating leftover bar food. I remember one night finding Marcus asleep standing up, leaning against the storage room wall with inventory sheets clutched in his hand. But it worked. By the end of year 1, we were breaking even. Year 2, we were profitable enough to open a second location in Cambridge. By year 3, we had 5 Last Call bars across Massachusetts, each with its own twist but the same core concept, unpretentious quality with personality. The money started flowing in. We moved out of our shared apartment into separate condos. Marcus bought a Tesla, I invested in a cabin in the Berkshires. Life was good, better than we'd imagined during those college nights. I first noticed something was off during the planning for our 6th location. Marcus scheduled a meeting with potential investors and forgot to tell me until afterward. "Just an oversight," he said, shrugging it off. "Besides, you hate these schmooze sessions. I was doing you a favor." A month later, our bank called about unusual activity in our business accounts. Large transfers I hadn't authorized. When I asked Marcus, he became defensive. "I'm trying to accelerate our growth. Sometimes you need to move fast in this business, Michael. You're too cautious, it's holding us back." Then came the computer glitch that locked me out of our financial software. And the misplaced documents about our new property acquisition. Small things, easily explained away, but they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. One Tuesday morning, I arrived at our main office to find the locks changed. The receptionist, Jenny, who I'd personally hired 3 years earlier, looked at me with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. Mr. Reed said you're no longer authorized to enter without an appointment." I called Marcus immediately. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded when he answered. "We need to talk," he said calmly. "Meet me at the original Last Call in an hour." The bar was empty when I arrived, unusual for lunchtime. Marcus sat at our regular booth, documents spread before him, looking like a king holding court. "I've restructured the company," he said without preamble. "The board voted yesterday." "What board?" "We don't have a board." He smiled thinly. "We do now. The investors thought it best to formalize our governance structure as we expand nationally." He slid a document toward me. My stomach dropped as I scanned it, a new operating agreement showing Marcus with 85% ownership and me with 15%. "This is impossible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I never agreed to this." "You did." He pointed to a signature, my signature, at the bottom. 6 months ago. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but I'd never seen this document before. You forged this, I said, my hands shaking with rage. Marcus leaned back, unfazed. That's a serious accusation, Michael. One you'd have trouble proving, especially against all the other documentation showing the transition of ownership interests. What documentation? The quarterly transfers you approved. The board minutes you signed. The restructuring agreement from last fall. He gestured to the stack beside him. It's all there, properly filed and notarized. My head spun. None of this had happened. Yet here was the evidence, my name on every document. Why? I asked, struggling to understand. We were successful. We were friends. It's just business, man, he said, shrugging. You're great at startups, but scaling? That's not your strength. I'm saving us from your limitations. You stole my company. Prove it, he smirked. Or take the severance package and move on. $2 million is generous for someone who's become redundant. I stood in our bar, the place where I'd spent hundreds of sleepless nights, where I'd sacrificed my health, relationships, and youth, and realized I'd lost. The empire we built together had been stolen through careful, methodical fraud. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching me break. You'll regret this, I said quietly. Marcus laughed. Don't make threats you can't back up. It's embarrassing. I left without another word, ignoring the pitying glances from staff who'd watched the scene unfold. Some had been with us from the beginning. Now they were his employees alone. That night, I sat in my condo surrounded by last call memorabilia, photos, business awards, our first dollar framed on the wall, and considered my options. I could fight him legally, but he'd clearly spent months creating a paper trail. It would be my word against documentation that, to any outsider, would appear legitimate. I could take the money and disappear. $2 million wasn't what the business was worth, but it was enough to start over somewhere else. Or I could destroy him. By morning, I'd made my decision. I accepted the severance package with a smile that confused Marcus. I cleared out my office without complaint. I even attended the goodbye happy hour he arranged, where uncomfortable employees watched me toast to new beginnings. And then I vanished, from Boston, from Marcus's radar, from the nightlife scene entirely. Let him think he'd won. What Marcus didn't realize was that I knew him better than anyone. I knew his strengths, his charisma, his networking abilities, his talent for making people feel special. But I also knew his weaknesses, his sloppiness with details, his gambling habit he thought no one knew about, his tendency to cut corners when stressed. Most importantly, I knew his patterns. For 6 months, I watched from afar. I rented a small apartment in Somerville under a different name. I grew a beard. I took consulting jobs that required minimal public exposure. And I gathered information. First, I hired a private investigator, an ex-IRS agent named Diana who specialized in financial fraud. She discovered that Marcus had been siphoning company funds into shell corporations for over a year. The expansion capital he claimed to be raising was actually disappearing into offshore accounts. Then I reached out to former employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances. There were more than I expected. Each had a story about Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior and questionable business practices. Next, I anonymously contacted vendors who'd been stiffed by the company recently. Marcus had been extending payment terms, then disputing invoices to avoid paying altogether. Finally, I bribed a cleaning person at Marcus's condo building for access to his trash. It wasn't glamorous work, sorting through coffee grounds and takeout containers for discarded documents, but it yielded gold, crumpled notes about tax strategies that crossed well into evasion territory. I was building a case, piece by patient piece. Meanwhile, Marcus was expanding recklessly. He'd opened 3 new locations in 6 months, each more lavish than the last. He'd been featured in Entrepreneur magazine as a nightlife visionary. He'd even started dating a minor celebrity, a reality TV star who brought paparazzi attention to every opening. But I could see the cracks forming. The original locations were suffering from neglect. Staff turnover had increased dramatically. And reviews were declining as Marcus focused on flash over substance. When I judged the moment was right, I began my counterattack. First, I established a relationship with Daniel Forrester, Marcus's largest investor, under the guise of a hospitality industry consultant. Over several meetings, I expressed concerns about certain trends in the last call financials that were publicly available. "I'm not saying anything improper is happening," I told him carefully. "But these growth patterns combined with these expense ratios? They don't add up in this industry." I planted just enough doubt to make him start asking questions I knew Marcus couldn't answer truthfully. Next, I anonymously mailed documentation of tax irregularities to the IRS. Not everything I had, just enough to trigger an audit. Then I reached out to Alyssa Chen, a business reporter who had written the entrepreneur profile. I didn't reveal my identity, but I provided evidence that several of the facts Marcus had given her were fabricated, including revenue figures and expansion timelines. "If I were you," I suggested in our encrypted chat, "I'd follow up on that profile. There's a much more interesting story beneath the surface." The dominoes were set. Now I just had to wait for them to fall. It took less time than I expected. The IRS audit triggered a broader financial investigation. The reporter's follow-up questions led Marcus to make contradictory statements that raised red flags with investors. And those investors, already concerned about recent performance issues, began withholding additional funding. Without new cash infusions, Marcus couldn't maintain his breakneck expansion. Construction stopped on 2 new locations. Bills went unpaid. Staff started quitting en masse as paychecks arrived late. Still, Marcus might have weathered the storm if not for my final move. I had saved one crucial piece of evidence, an audio recording from 3 years earlier. We had been celebrating the opening of our 3rd location, and Marcus, drunk on success and expensive bourbon, had boasted about how he'd bribed a health inspector to overlook violations that would have delayed our opening. "Sometimes you gotta break the rules to make the rules," he'd slurred while I recorded on my phone, thinking I was taking a video of our celebration. I'd forgotten about it until finding the file during my evidence gathering. Now I sent it anonymously to the State Regulatory Board, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and every major investor in Last Call. The reaction was swift and merciless. On a rainy Thursday morning, federal agents entered all 7 Last Call locations simultaneously. They seized computers, files, and accounting records. Marcus was led out of the flagship location in handcuffs, his expression one of utter disbelief. I watched from across the street, rain soaking through my jacket. As they placed him in the back of an unmarked car, his eyes met mine. Recognition dawned slowly, then fury. "You," he shouted. "This is you." I simply shrugged, echoing his words from months earlier. "It's just business, man." The media frenzy was immediate and brutal. The golden boy of Boston's nightlife empire exposed as a fraud. Tax evasion. Embezzlement. Bribery of public officials. The charges kept coming as investigators unraveled the web of financial manipulation. Most of the Last Call locations closed within weeks. Investors filed lawsuits. Employees lost jobs. The brand became toxic overnight. I watched it all from a distance, feeling, not satisfaction exactly. Something more complicated. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I received a letter from his attorney offering to return my original ownership stake as part of a settlement agreement. Too little, too late. The company was worthless now, burdened with debt and legal problems. Instead, I used what remained of my severance package to lease a small space in Cambridge, ironically, a former last call location that had been shuttered. I renovated it myself, creating something intimate and authentic. 1 month before opening, I still hadn't settled on a name. Then, on the day Marcus pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, it came to me. When reporters asked about my new establishment, I simply said, it's a place where people can come for an honest drink and straight talk. No pretense. No lies. The sign above the door, however, says it all: betrayal. Business has been excellent from day one. People are drawn to the name, the story they think they know, and the mystery of the owner who rarely speaks about his past. Sometimes customers ask about the framed newspaper article behind the bar, the one announcing Marcus Reed's 7-year prison sentence. I just tell them it's a reminder. Not of victory. Not even of justice. But of the thin line between partnership and betrayal. Between success and ruin. Between friendship and its opposite. Marcus writes to me sometimes from prison. I never respond. What would I say? That destroying him didn't bring the satisfaction I expected? That success tastes different the second time around, tinged with something bitter? Instead, I focus on building something that can't be stolen. A business founded not on friendship or trust, but on the hard lessons of their absence. And if Marcus thinks this story is over, he's mistaken. I've merely written the first chapter.